I wonder, in your experience, what is awry in the healthcare of modern Americans, and that we have access to all the medications, all the biohacks, all the hospitals, all the drugs, all the weights, all the gym memberships, all the food, all the education, all the information, it's all there. Yet statistically speaking, the trend is going towards more obesity, more sickness, and more self-harm. Do you have any, where does your mind go with that?
That's a great question. I'm excited to engage with this question along with the YouTubers.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just as an aside, I don't have data on it, but I mean, I'm sure you've noticed the same thing. You're so much better off. I mean, barring like a chronic health condition or comorbidity, I guess we say today, or barring some kind of like severe genetic thing, man, you're just so much better taking your own health in your own hands right now. Cause like you said, all those tools are widely available. It's not hard to find them. And the challenge is sorting through it because there's so much. But I mean, I would say, though, in answer to your question, what's the problem is I think that the model we're using for healthcare most closely resembles the model that we use for factory farming of cattle or livestock. So we're taking a really similar approach to how we treat cows and sheep, this idea of sort of like mass inoculations, mass antibiotics, fortification of extremely inexpensive diets. So you take a diet that's devoid of certain nutrients and then you just fortify them in. So I'm always amused, like the milk has vitamin D added to it. The salt has iodine added to it. The bread has B vitamins added to it. It's like you want to be like, hello, everyone. That's because none of those nutrients are in the foods you're eating. Like, that's a problem. Yeah. And the idea is like, yes, eventually you'll get sick, but like, then we'll treat that down the road. But yeah, I think that it's like a factory farm model. And I think we want to be moving more towards, it's like if you were going to buy a side of beef from somebody, I'd rather buy it from my local farmer up the street who's organic, who's got a small operation and where the soil's really healthy. I don't want to buy it from a CAFO. And similarly, I think when we look at the healthcare model, it's like, hey, I need to have something more organic going on here and free range, not something in the factory system.
Yeah. So a common argument from folks would be, to revert to supporting regenerative farms or a more ancestral based lifestyle, which we can unpack what that means exactly. It's almost like we've come too far. We're overpopulated, which is an idea and a story that could be wildly incorrect and could be wildly dangerous, or maybe not. I'm open to different discussions of that as well. But is it a meaningful argument that perhaps we've almost like painted ourselves into a corner with our industrialization and development of our population? And like, is it possible to feed the masses from a more healthy ancestral approach to nutrition? I don't know if that question is really like a perfect question, but do you know what I'm getting at? Like,
I do. And there's like multiple things in there. We'd really have to unpack it.
I apologize. Yeah.
No, please don't. No, I'm glad you're asking it. No, it's great. I'm enjoying the discussion.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I understand the argument there because there are those folks who say, I think what's happening right now is we're feeling that there's a top down, like a factory farm. Old McDonald at the top of the pyramid wants to make some sweeping changes in how he runs the factory farm. And us as sheep, we're feeling these changes taking place and it's generating resistance from us. So, from some of us. So when we hear things like it used to be, we all kind of agreed that there was a lot of people, but now there's a little pushback against that because of these kind of Green New Deal approaches, which feel very top down. They're definitely not grassroots, right? They're like, we're going to change the world. We're going to do a great reset of your world or whatever. So there's a lot of resistance to that. As somebody who hunts, fishes, and forages, I can tell you that I think there's too many people just because of, it's not that the earth can't support us. It's can it support us and all the habitats that support all the species that we share the planet with if we care about that. Maybe we don't care about that. And maybe we're like, hey, we're cool to be with just like crows and coyotes and cockroaches. Maybe that's actually going to be fine for us. But if we want all that diversity of a David Attenborough documentary, I think there are too many people. But that doesn't mean that the earth couldn't support 50 billion humans. I just don't know that it could do that and have all of the ecosystems that we have today and keep any of that intact. So that's one component of that conversation.
Can I ask something there?
Yeah,
just
please.
in relation to that,
Yeah.
have you heard much of the research suggesting that by 2045, 2050 or so, there's going to be a dramatic population drop off, largely due to exposure to plastics and the BPCs and the various different chemicals in there, leading to essentially infertility among modern people, and then also a transition towards like it not being that cool to have kids and feminism and wanting to be like boss babe, and there's a potential transition away from perpetuating the species that maybe right now maybe there are maybe a bit too many people, but perhaps there could be a violent drop off coming soon that could change the tune around that conversation. And this is again way outside of my depth. These are just little headlines that I pull that I think are interesting, and I'd be curious your perspective.
Yeah, I'm out of my lane too.
Oh, great! Here we are.
So let's. So yeah,
maybe we'll pull back
behind the wheel here. All right, but drunk behind the wheel. Here's what I have to say about it.
Okay.
Okay. I love all your points are really observable. I mean, I don't need data to see it. My mom was one of 9 kids. That totally normal for her era. 9 kids. She goes on to have 3 kids. I'm 43 years old. I have 0 kids.
Yeah.
Now, whether or not there's a massive population decline uniformly across the world is another question, because it appears to me from what I've seen that that's happening here in the first world, so-called first world, the developed world, I guess. But then in the developing world, population rates are increasing, especially like as parts of China get access to the kind of living conditions that we've had, not just China, around the world, as people get access to the kind of living conditions that we have. So I think it's interesting. I think there's a decline in some populations, not necessarily all, but yeah, I think that will happen. And I think all those factors from, like you said, the sort of endocrine disrupting xenochemicals to just social, education. Another big component of it, obviously, I just took a drive the other day. I was driving about 5 hours to breed my dog with a guy I hunt with who's, my dog came out of his pack and he's 72, 73. Very insightful hanging out with somebody that age. He remembers the first TV that he got when he was 8, and he remembers when telephones were a shared line and there would be an operator on and people around town could just pick up the phone and spy on your phone calls because everybody had a shared line. Like, he's watched the world really, really change. And when he was a kid, you needed a pile of children to help on the farm. So today, a pile of children is a tremendous expense. It's a burden. And when those kids get older, they don't even take care of you anymore, really. So I think, the conditions have changed dramatically. And I think another component of this to keep in mind is we've moved tremendously from the natural environment and then the sort of a hybrid built in natural environment to a much more built environment. And now we're heading towards a much more digital environment. And probably we're not even really equipped to speculate what the social conditions that will create will be, because nobody's really had to adapt to that environment yet. So in the way that, anybody living in the city for any period of time becomes really adapted to fit for that environment, we don't know what fitness looks like yet in the metaverse. So remains an unknown. We can only speculate and what impact that's going to have. But I would suspect that there'll come a time where breeding will not be considered a right. It'll be considered a privilege, and it'll probably be managed at the factory farm level. So just looking at the trend or the trajectory, that's what I would anticipate, in the same way that carbon is, it's not yet, right? Like I can burn as much gas as I want and I'm allowed to exhale and nobody taxes me on that yet, but that's not forever. So, I mean, assuming that we could continue on this trend line without a massive disruption to the civilization, like a reset to the civilization, which, for anybody who's like, that's crazy talk. It's like, well, ask them how Egypt did, or Rome or Greece or Mesopotamia. I mean, all of those civilizations did go through similar trend lines. And from what I understand about it, what happens is the elite class gets really out of touch with what's going on with the class that produces goods and food and things like that. And that leads to eventually to a kind of instability that leads to collapse. So, we see all that around us too. So it's hard to say, but yeah, I don't think that wild sexual breeding is going to be common in the future. You see that kind of concept in the Brave New World.
Man.
Can I add to our initial question though of how I just had one more point I want to
keep going.
I don't think that we really have come to terms, over the last, what would you say, probably since 2014 or so, there's been socio-political conversations taking place at the national level that to some of us who are biologically minded or have a take our ancestral past into consideration when thinking about the future. There's been some discussions that have made no sense at the biological level. They only make sense at like a sociological level. I'll let the user interpret that however they want. Yeah. There's been a lot of things I found very I mean, I understand them intellectually, but I find them a little confusing. But then I think like, okay, we haven't really figured out what it means to live at the apex of the pyramid of like the Maslow hierarchy of needs. So we're, for the first time, like, you can go out your door. There's no marauding bands of, thieves and bandits. There's no, like, you're not being like forced to farm as a serf for the, whatever landholder. There's war, of course, and atrocity and starvation and all of that, but most of us never see it. We're living like at a time where all of our survival needs are met, our social needs we're actually oversaturated with all the things we need to survive. So when I was talking to this guy who I was saying is in his 70s, and we went to visit his friend who's in his 70s, I was asking him what it was like growing up, and they both said food was everything. Like, that was everything. Like, all you were thinking about every day was food. They grew up on farms. They bought sugar and flour, both of them, but otherwise, like, everything else came off their land or they bartered it. And every day and they were happy. They said it wasn't hardship. It was just because that's all you knew. But every day was like about making sure there was enough food to feed. He was saying to me, he'd go out fishing for brook trout. Like, as an example of the shifting baseline, I can go out and catch 5 brook trout a day. And that's my legal limit here in Maine. He would go out, he'd have to catch 150 of them because he's like, there was 8 men in my house that needed to eat, like, plus the women. He's like, you have any idea how much food that takes? So they're like thinking about food all the time. What we're thinking about is, how can I burn off some of this food I'm eating because I'm going to get too fat? This is like a whole new, aside from like emperors and people in the royal courts, nobody's ever had to think about this stuff before. We've never had. So what's happened now is like all our needs are met. So we're getting into a real nitpicky place of trying to like find problems. We're trying to find problems because that's part of our nature. Seek out problems, create solutions. It's a bit of who we are, but we kind of ran out of survival-based problems. So now we're tearing into social problems, which is probably good at some level, but we're acting like as if they have the same implications as our survival problems have, which they clearly don't. And your question, I think, is modified by that fact, or like once we recognize that, you know what I mean by that Maslow hierarchy of needs. Once we recognize where we are on there, it's like, oh, we're at self-actualization. So everybody's out there trying to self-actualize, and almost in like in a capitalist system. So there's this almost like competitive self-actualization, which is like this is like a weird new thing. So I think, I don't know what it was like at the peak of other civilizations, but I think we're kind of in an uncharted territory right now.
It's interesting. I feel like the Maslow's hierarchy with the self-actualization, a lot of reverting back to some of the more like primitive ancestral lifestyle techniques or experiences, I think is kind of like a passageway to bring people into this deeper sense of what they would maybe for the first time in their lives call self-actualization. Like, oh, like there was something deeper. I was on this top layer. And then I think it moves in this cyclical fashion. And I think it's interesting with, what you're saying of humans naturally, innately have evolved from nature in this perfect manner. And every action that we do, that we're compelled to do, whether it's sex or hunting or gathering or anything that we're doing, those systems are also, they're like innate tuning mechanisms. I'm borrowing that language from Philip Beach, who wrote a book called Muscles and Meridians. He called spending time on the ground, for example, archetypal postures of repose. So just through your existence in this natural, in quotations, environment, it's like your body circulates its fluids, and it digests its food, and it oscillates in and out of sympathetic and parasympathetic, and you naturally go through different fields of vision, and your body just like breathes. And then when you begin to divorce yourself from that, you have to suddenly, by necessity, you need to start to juggle all of these variables. And that's where I think it's really complicated. Like the human self regulates and self organizes in this miraculous, beautiful fashion. When you divorce it from the environmental conditions that naturally induce that self-actualization, that's when it's like, holy fuck, this is complicated.
Yeah. Which might be part of the
to handle it.
Might be part of the original question about healthcare and what's gone wrong. Because man, where are you right now?
Texas, Austin.
Oh man, I'm seeing how pale I look compared to you right now.
Oh, I just go outside. I'm just no matter what's happening, I go outside. That's like a part of my
but you
preference.
can't. There's not enough UV up here yet. Like you can go outside, but you can't tan yet. It's we're too far north in latitude. Okay, so earlier on when you asked about what's going on in healthcare, so as you've probably noticed, especially by podcasting in this space. And this is something I've talked a lot about in the past, was the biohacking approach can get pretty cumbersome the more stuff you start to try to stack. This is just a law of nature. I mean, it happens at the atomic level. It's like, okay, you can stack protons and electrons for a while. You go like hydrogen, 1 and 1, helium, 2 and 2. You can go up the chain for a while, but you get up to what is it, like 92 uranium, and all of a sudden now it's radioactive. Shit's breaking off, spinning off, gamma radiation, all that, right? It's like it's unstable. When you live unnaturally, so you then want to try to approximate nature, and you're like, okay, well, at night I wouldn't have access to this kind of light, so I'm going to wear the orange glasses, and okay, now I need to do cold baths, and okay, I'm going to make sure I do heat shock protein stuff, so I'm going to have the sauna. So I'll go sauna, ice bath, wear my glasses. Okay. Oh, I'm supposed to get exposed to this. So now I'm like in front of a big red light panel, and I'm like, oh wait, I gotta be grounded. So now I'm like plugged into the ground. You stack enough of this stuff, and it becomes incredibly unstable and narcissistic to a degree where you're like, I mean, what's my life about here, really? We all have to stack stuff. No question. If we want to be productive, I'm not trying to. Sometimes it's easy to. I'm making fun of it because it's easy to. It's low hanging fruit, but it's like we're all doing that. I'm doing that to a degree too. So
it's not the thing. It's what's behind the thing. Why are you doing the thing, and who do you think you are as you're doing it?
At a certain point, we are a mouse on the wheel because the mouse can't go anywhere in the tank. So in order to get the exercise it needs to stay even remotely fit, we put the wheel in there to approximate just the amount of walking a mouse should be doing, right? So we're doing that. So back to your question about the healthcare system, one wonders, the healthcare system seems to be part of, the modern one seems to be part of the transhumanist paradigm, which kind of says whatever we come from is base and banal and beneath us. Progressivism is the answer. We need to progress toward something beyond human, hence the idea of transhuman, merge with technology, merge with machines, become gods. Like, by the way, this has been tried before. There's some great stories about it. Anyway, so we're trying to head towards that. Well, medicine doesn't really like looking at like the ancestral stuff. So I think it's been confusing to a lot of us over the last couple decades as these ideas have filtered to the common person who's trying to take care of their health. Because now if you are, it's not long before you come across somebody in the ancestral health space who says like some simple sentence that goes like, oh my God, you just suddenly get it. It's like, oh yeah, I'm a type of animal. Like I should probably factor that into how I take care of myself. Well, the factory farm is, I gave that analogy before. And the whole point of it is the factory farm and the zoo were like really opposite things. Like you could, from a distance, you might go, oh, both keep captive animals, but it's like, no, one keeps domesticated animals captive and one keeps wild animals captive. And one's whole purpose, the farm, is to extract produce from those animals or labor from those animals. And the other one is simply to keep the animals healthy as long as possible for observation. So one's goal is healthy animals that live like they would in the wild. So you go to the zoo and what do you see for confinement? You see pens set up to look like and feel like the wild environment the animal's from. No one wants to go see a lion in a white room. They want to see a lion on a rock, even if it's a fake rock, with a waterfall, even if it's a fake waterfall, with plants around that approximate its natural habitat. You would never do that on a farm because it's an economic model and the goal is to put the least inputs in possible. So what do? You get ugly pens, horrible cages, confinement, because the goal is to spend as little as possible and make as much on the back end as possible. So when you look at our system, you're like, oh, whoa, we're not doing a zoo for people. We're doing a factory farm for people. Like people will say euphemistically, like, oh, the human zoo. It's like, no, the human farm, silly. If this was a zoo, we would be doing what Carnivore MD's been saying, or Dave Asprey's been saying, or whatever, any of these characters out there who, what I've been saying, like anybody in this space, what you've been saying, like anybody who gets that we're animals. We would be like doing more of the things culturally, but we're not because it's a farm. And so, or it works like a farm. So I guess another point is like, if medicine started to look at that and that became common to think this way, there would be like a bit of a revolution of like of thought, like, wait, why are we even doing any of this then? If it's so bad for us, like, what's the goal of all this progressivism? Is there a goal? Like, because you'd think like, well, what are we aiming at? You know, what are we trying to get to? And then I guess that would leave the next question would be like, well, do we want to go there? And a lot of people might say no if they were actually asked. I think I would.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Marshall McLuhan? Medium is the message. Medium is the massage. Is a book he wrote. It's
not really.
The idea is
really. Not enough.
A big part of, at least the meaning of that statement is that we go to school and we think that we're learning algebra or poetry or whatever, but in fact, the medium in which we were steeping in is informing us to the highest degree. So the shape of the classroom, the lights, the walls, like the deeper subconscious patterns that you're picking up from the teachers and your peers and the cultural systems and all, like that's really what's forming you. Yeah, and then there's like the minutia of the details of, algebra. And I think it's an interesting way to perceive our existence. Starting off, I think it's kind of like an interesting chicken and the egg question, because you could start off say like, well, the agrarian age started 10 to 12,000 years ago or whatever. And then we started forming ourselves to being more like this farm-based model. And then within that, then it goes into like industrial population or industrialization, and then into this technological era. And then maybe we're going to become, robots or AI or whatever. And I think it's interesting to draw back and kind of question, like, what was it, chicken or the egg? Did we make the farm, or did the farm mentality make us? Did we make the technology, or did the technology form us? Obviously, it's a back and forth dance, but I think that's kind of what you're getting at. And that's something that I've been scratching my head at for a bit. Like, who's informing what here exactly? Who's in control? You know what I mean?
If I start to touch that, I know that's not really a question, thankfully, because if I start to touch that, it's gonna get real weird in here.
Yeah, that's good. That's what we're here for that.
Yeah, I think another way we can look at the progress too, because I agree with you about like we go from sort of like hunting and gathering to, unfortunately, I've got a friend who now I am nauseated by the everything's racism thing that's kind of taken place. Why is because there's a lot of real racism, and it's a lot of it is deeply embedded in systemic, I guess, but there's a lot of stuff that's been called that lately. It just means you don't agree with me, which sucks because it dilutes things and blah, blah, blah. So as I'm about to bring up this racism thing, please know I'm not one of those people who runs around calling everything racist, like quite the opposite. But I've got a friend in the foraging space who has written a manuscript about the origins of anthropology, and it's powerful. And it looks at, through the writings of the original anthropologists, he makes an extremely compelling, probably irrefutable argument for anthropology as a apology for colonialism. And one of the things that it tends to do is be like, well, we were hunter-gatherers and then we got into agriculture. It's like, okay, we were hunter-gatherers this long and we got into agriculture this long ago. So we kind of act like that past is just this like short little blip of, like we love to say things like prehistoric. Like, you mean everything that happened? Because history is 6,000 years old. That's when we have the first written down shit. So to take a planet this old and to just be like, oh, that's all prehistory, it's quite, it really reduces the value of all of that time and all of that space, right? One way I like to look at it, like another way to kind of consider the phylogeny of it or whatever you'd call that, is like, I think about with fire, because the first humans have fire, like we get it from Homo erectus. So it's pretty old technology. We figured out a really long time ago. We don't really know much about how that happened, but we've had it longer than Homo sapiens have been around. So I think it goes from human beings around the fire to human beings around the fireplace in much smaller groups, to human beings around the TV in even smaller groups, to human beings around the computer as individuals, and now as human beings around the phone, completely separated from each other. And we're about to go into human beings in a closet with a feed bag over their eyes. Like, it'd be another way to chart the progress of this whole event we kind of call the Neolithic Revolution, and all plus all that prehistory. And again, I just think we have no sense of the feedback over the eyes thing. It's like, all of that stuff in this whole metaverse. It's going to really exacerbate all these issues we're talking about. Like, as we talk about the idea of living on a factory farm, it's like, hey, that's not taking us in the right direction. That's for sure.
It's the reason that I asked the whole medium is the message Marshall McLuhan did we start farming, or did farming start us? Did we start technology, or does technology and farming? Like, who's in charge here? Is I feel like there is a function to most everything that exists. And sometimes you could look at things at a microscopic level and be like, oh my God, this is a travesty that this war is happening, or that white blood cell is attacking that, whatever. There's like, it's like, no. And then you draw back and you see the symphony. You're like, okay, I understand. It was really good that was happening. And so I guess that's my curiosity, is like, is there some deeper, like omnipotent knowing of what's going on right now, and what we perceive to be incredibly unhealthy and terrible, objectively speaking? I wonder if there could be some like deeper consciousness to the whole thing. I know that's like, I don't expect you to have an answer.
Well, I do. I kind of have a thought about it. I mean, I don't have the answer, of course, any more than you do. It seems like something we're both thinking about. But I like this biblical concept that if you want to know a thing, you just judge its fruits. So it's like, is that tree good? Well, let's see what the quality of its fruit is. And many of the things that are happening now, when you look at the fruit of it, in other words, like, what is it? What is the outcome of it? What kind of emotions does it generate? What kind of behaviors come out of it? What kind of feelings come out of it? What kind of, all of this stuff, like what comes out of it? A lot of it looks really poisonous to me. So it's a tough sell for me that if you take all this poisonous stuff and you build it all up, it's actually part of some greater good. I think that if it was actually trending towards something better, the fruits of it would be good, because it's like a hologram. Like, every small part of the hologram is still a exact replica of the hologram, or like a fractal thing, where it's like, if it's good, big, then all the pieces of it should also be good too. And I don't see that myself. And I don't like the idea that we live in a universe where there's something wrong going on. I don't like that idea, but that gets us to bigger questions about what the universe even is. Yeah. And is it what we kind of think it is,
Yeah. Coming back to ground. And I enjoy venturing into those directions, but oftentimes, typically what happens is it comes into this kind of circular head scratching experience, which is kind of where I'm at with that. I was like, okay, where's like rubber hit the road? We're actually making shifts with conversation.
How then shall we live?
Yeah. And then I think it's an important thing to be able to reflect on. And I think it's an important thing, like conversations like this in my ideal world, would be the things that spawn up when you're at the gym, and you're working out and you're moving with your buds, you're picking up freaking hay bales or swinging hammers or sprinting or running or jumping over hurdles or going for a hike or going hunting or going gathering or going for a walk. Or I think that there's this really beautiful relationship between allowing your mind to travel into these directions and reflect, and also the movement of it. And it's something that I wonder with you, like the way that you move is different than most people that I know, because most of the people that I'm in relation to are like kind of gym culture type people. And the way that you move is in nature much more. You probably are doing some other random. You're probably
I do a lot of that other stuff too, but
kettlebells and stuff. But I wonder how that's informed the way that you think, because I'm sure it has. You moving in nature and also having a background and awareness of kinesiology and like the whole, just that relationship with the way that your body affects the way that you feel and the way that you think and your physiology. Is that something that you notice when you're moving in nature? Have you noticed it like changing you in a way?
Yeah, there's a lot there. Well, first I just want to go back and say, talking about my older friends there, a conversation like we just had 70 years ago, for most people, would have been so masturbatory. Again, we're at that top of that pyramid of the hierarchy of needs that we can even have, that we can even waste 30 minutes on that conversation instead of getting food or doing some other labor that leads to our survival, right? It's like, wow, we get to sit around and talk about this stuff. Is crazy. This has never happened before at this level. I mean, there's been people and thinkers, but just that two random folks can do this and make a living out of it it's kooky.
Well, mythology's been around for a long time, and looking into the stars and sitting around a fire and reflecting on gods and mythos and such. I think that's been a long, far pre-history, you know, whatever the first document was put down. So I would play devil's advocate to that and suggest that we've probably been making stories up for a while and probably been scratching our heads
culturally. But did we have time to sit around and do this individually? Because those stories developed over long periods of time and were carried only by certain individuals whose job was to kind of carry those stories, and they weren't allowed to alter them. And it's funny when you talk to people who still carry those kind of traditions, because they're not always interested in exploring what they mean even. But I get what you're saying. Okay. But my point is, so for the last, I guess it's been about this will be the 7th year, I decided, okay, I'm sick of just talking about all this ancestral stuff. I'm going to go become a hunter-gatherer, and I want to get some food like that in a more serious way. It's not like all I eat, of course, since I'm, in fact, not even close, but more than most people will ever come get the opportunity to do. So it's like, what happens if I really start to live this stuff in nature? So I do get to spend a lot of time outdoors, but my body was formed in the built environment, you know, and like, it's not like all of a sudden you wake up and now you've got like a perfect like hunter-gatherer squat because you go hunting or something. Not quite. But it does take care of a lot of those little things. Like, you want a little cold exposure, you don't need an ice bath, like come outside and we'll find some, or heat exposure, all those kind of things. But I also want to point out, like, in the past, we're all anticipating these very long lifespans. And so part of what we're doing to take care of ourselves now is because we're looking for longevity. Like, I want my teeth to last as long as my body's around. I want to be symmetrically balanced. So like, a lot of humans who, it's not like you just go to like, I know people who've lived their whole life farming. It's not like they're in like amazing physical fitness. Mostly they're like injured and pretty beat up and stuff. So I think, I don't know, it's not, I kind of thought initially it would replace all that stuff for me. Now I find myself having to go back to a lot of those things, because the reality is I come home at the end of the day and sleep in a bed, in a house with heat and all those kind of things. Like, I have showers. Like, I can't speak to what it would be like to really live out there, but the people that I see who do, here's the interesting thing. Okay. So an animal, almost always, not every animal, but almost all of them are going to live longer in the zoo than they will live in the wild. The wild is hard on your body. There's a lot of benefits. So we tend to, in the ancestral health community, tend to like to just focus on those things. But we don't like to focus on all the things that go wrong out there, and why, you know, there's a myth that the hunter-gatherer average lifespan is super, super short. It's not accurate. There's, you know, when you average things and when you have 50% child mortality, well, that's going to, think 50% of the kids dying at 0 is going to bring the average down. It's like, it's gonna. And then because we can't really date skeletal remains past age 55, we tend to just say everybody was 55. And, you know, it's not accurate. But nature, you get a lot of bumps and bruises, and you get beat up, and you get a lot of imbalances, especially from carrying loads all the time and doing it in weird ways and running away from your enemies and trying not to get infections and getting broken bones. So I think what we want, ideally, it's like some kind of hybrid.
Yeah.
It's because we're not getting away from the built environment. There's nowhere to go. If I walk out of my house, I've got 31 acres of woods here that I live on. But if I walk very far, I'm going to run into somebody's backyard in every direction. Like, there's no going to like live on the land anyway. So we're going to be living inside. So I think some kind of hybridized thing where it's like, I want to go get all the great things out of nature that it provides, but I also want to get the good things out of that the zoo provides, because I'd like to live a long life.
Yeah.
You know, I'd like to keep all my teeth. I'd like to minimize broken bones in hypothermia and all those kind of things that happen outside. So does that make sense? It's kind of, I thought it was going to be a bigger solution than it is. what I have found is that the hunting and gathering component is super rewarding.
Yeah.
And it connects you to something so real that most of what you hear about on the day-to-day level, just, you're like, this shit is ridiculous.
Yeah. That's
like, try doing something real, you know?
I was listening to your podcast is called WildFed, and you just did a conversation with a falconer, and I grew up in falconry. My dad was a falconer.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
such a rare community.
Like
wow.
There's a whole long story to it. But so one of the things that he mentioned is that typically a bird of prey, probably varying depending upon which ones, he's probably talking about like red-tailed hawks or something, average lifespan in the wild would be about 5 years is what he said. And I think in captivity is like 20 years or something.
Yeah, maybe even 30, he might have said.
Yeah, something like that. I think, it was a lot longer. And so it's interesting because it's very common to romanticize the hunter-gatherer ancestral lifestyle. And I think oftentimes what that is it comes back to circling back to kind of what you were saying in the beginning of like, it's almost like a divorcing or a shunning of ourselves in a way. Like, I think there's like, that's like transitioning into this technological era where we're becoming AI and we're going to buy an AI mansion and have an AI, identity avatar and all that stuff. It's like this inbred story that we gathered along at some point that this isn't okay. And I'll be better when. Like, that's, I think, the thing that we do with the romanticization of any other lifestyle.
We do it with the AI thing too. I mean,
doing it with
the people
AI
who are into
thing.
that are painting a utopia. And I look at it, I'm like, dude, that's the Hunger Games, idiot. What are you thinking? Like, no, but they're picturing it like Star Trek. Yeah. Like on Star Trek, like whenever you were doing the face-to-face communication thing, like they always had a great signal. You notice that? Like whenever they hit that little chest thing, it's like, oh yeah, you always have a signal. You're on other planets, you always have a signal. Because let me tell you how it really works.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't, but your batteries never die. Like everything is always perfect. That was like the funny thing when you watch Star Trek versus Star Wars, like Star Wars, everything's like beat up and dingy and grungy. You're like, that's a little more accurate. Star Trek, it was like, everything was always like perfect. It's like, if it's like that, then it's an oppressive society. What is this, North Korea in space?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, how is it that perfect? Right. So we're utopian on either side. So you have, I'm super guilty of being doing the utopia is nature thing. And Elon Musk is maybe guilty of utopia is the AI world or whatever. Neither one's going to be utopia. They're going to be full of the suffering. That's just part of that's the Buddhist thing. Hey, life has a suffering component.
Yeah.
That balances out the great joys and the elation and the ecstasy and all of that. But if I had to pick a way to hybridize this, going back to what I've been saying, is the zoo is a really good analogy. I like a zoo with an open door. So again, the difference is a zoo creates habitat that's right for that specific species. The farm does not. The zoo feeds the animal the foods that are closest to what the animal would eat in the wild. Right? The zoo has all of these components socially for the animal. They're trying to recreate the natural habitat as much as possible. When you look at our environments, you're like, we are not doing that. We're doing this farm/jail type model, institutional model. The other thing that the zoo has, though, is those longer lifespans. So I would like to live in a zoo environment with an open door policy to the actual wild. That would be really nice.
Yeah.
Something like that. So we can get the best of both, but we're a ways away from even beginning to have a serious conversation about that outside of our little echo chambers of people who are interested in this stuff. I mean, and I'm glad we have that. We are really lucky to have that. But I noticed doing my podcast, after a while, you start feeling like everybody gets it. And then you go out and you talk to other people. And you're like, oh, they're not getting it yet.
Mm-hmm.
They're not getting it out there yet, or you go to an actual medical doctor and you talk to a medical doctor and you're like, whoa, we're on a different page, bro. Real different page.
I know that you'd have to be familiar with the Rat Park and
yeah.
That was I think it was
Johann Harry's work you're talking about and the idea of the cocaine and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think it was in like the 70s or 80s, but it essentially was like the idea that if you put a rat into a cage and give him access to cocaine, he'll just blow his life away and just become a drug addict and just keep on doing rails of cocaine. I don't think you do rails of cocaine actually. But if you put him in it
in the water, but
exactly. whatever it is.
Yeah.
But if you put him in this Rat Park scenario where you give him access to all the toys and all the things, give him a little rat girlfriend.
Other rats, I think, was the
other
big
rats.
thing. Is the social experiences with other rats was a huge part of it.
Right. Community,
Because it's
relationship.
the isolation, I think, was a big part of that problem.
Yeah. And suddenly it's like, oh, I'm not that interested in the drugs. And this is actually the thing that I really am interested in. Because I was going to say, go into kind of like, oh, like what's the perfect marriage between the hunter-gatherer lifestyle and modernity? But it feels like most signs that I see, point back to community. And I think a lot of the tribalism that we end up expressing in the form of veganism or carnivorism or ketoism or what, all the different
ismism.
I'm
an ismist.
Yeah, exactly. Like all the different things. It's we're have this dire urge to create a sensation of connection. I'm a part of something. And I think that that's really what we're like. We have these sublimated actions or urges that come out from this deep longing to be a part of something. Mm-hmm. And then you see like the longest longitudinal study, I think it was done at Harvard. I believe it started in 1936 and still going on. And what they found within that was that people with community, like meaningful connection to community, those people would live the longest and be the healthiest and all the things. And I think that a lot of the stuff that we're doing, going back to the very beginning of the conversation, these natural innate tuning mechanisms that would just organically transpire in nature. I think a big part of that was the tribe organizing around one common goal and then completing it and then join that on repetition, which is kind of like what we're still doing today. Community. I feel like
can
that's
I tear into that? Oh,
there's
there's some stuff there.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to come back. I want to make sure I circle back to community and octave up, because there's a bigger picture to this that I want to make sure we talk about.
Yeah.
But I would imagine, like me, you may have seen many people start communities with this very intention. And then have you watched them all like crash and burn the way I have, or have you seen any work? Because the ones I've seen are like they're nightmares. I would never ever want to be part of any of them.
I don't know. I feel like it depends on the definition of community. But
whenever people are like, dude, we're starting an intentional community.
Sure.
We're like, everybody's going to be like living the way that we all agree that's the right way to live, bro. It's like nightmare. Right. The thing about those, so you're talking about those studies looking at longest lived people, like blue zone people and stuff.
Sure.
And what you don't find is that this is a amalgamation of people from all over the place who didn't know each other. It's not the biodome. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like the idea that, so here's the problem. When we go back 70 years, and we were talking about this a little while ago, you're part of a family, maybe there's 5 to 15 kids. And then so are the neighbors and so are the neighbors. And you guys are all the neighborhood kids who all hang out, but your families all live there. They rely on each other. They've been there for 300 years in that area. If somebody came from far away, it's like very rare. There was no gentrification. There was no globalization yet. So people are relying on each other and they know each other. And there's this kinship and blood relationships that are going on there. And intermarriage policies, which humans are big on. This goes all the way back to our deep antiquity. Typically it's the females go to other tribes to be married in. You usually don't want to bring outside males into your tribe. And there's wisdom there. That's not sexism. That's like, I don't want precocious males coming into my tribe. No way. New lady? Sure. Some guy? No way.
Interesting. Right? Dude, that's the cardinal rule at a party.
Yeah.
High school, college, it's like, can I bring Bob? Like, nope.
Yeah, no.
Can't bring Bob.
No, you cannot.
Can I bring Kayla? Yep.
Yeah, sure thing. And bring her friend. So that was typically, and what you would do is create alliances between unrelated families through marriages. So now we're not doing that, right? Most people, now when I was growing up, I knew all the neighbors on my street. You remember, you used to like, how old are you?
34.
You may or may not remember. Millennials.
Yeah. What are the problems?
Man, I just went and saw the Batman the other day, and I'm a big fan of the Christopher Nolan Batman trilogy, like a big fan of it. And I was like, oh, like emo millennial Batman in now? Like, what is this? The guy from Twilight is Batman?
Yeah.
Okay, so you may or may not remember, but when I was growing up, we would just go to people's houses. You just go to someone's house. You wouldn't call or anything. Just show up and knock on the door and then like have you in, and people just were familiar.
Yeah.
I would never stop by my friend's house now without contacting
It's like
them.
it's like wildly rude. You're like, what?
Very rude.
Even FaceTiming somebody, it's like, who do you think you are?
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
coming into
Yeah. Oh my
phone.
God.
Where's your
FaceTime? Like,
face?
no way. Like, text me, dude. What, you think I'm not doing something right now? So, but also, like, I don't really know the people around me, my neighbors, right? We're all fractured off and really isolated. And there's been almost a systematic destruction of, this is like what I was saying about from the Fire to the iPhone to the Oculus. It's like from the big language group to the foraging group to the, down to the nuclear family, living in neighborhoods, down to the nuclear family living isolated, now down to individuals. And if you look at what's the trend line we're on, we're trending towards a world where parents don't really have possession of their children in the same way that we classically have thought of it. And you can see this languaging. My wife's involved in the school department. I see this languaging coming down through the schools now, top down. This idea that your kids aren't yours, they belong to the state, And so there's this separation off everybody's individual. The idea that you're going to take a bunch of these individuals who all have their own income sources, who all have their own isms and ideologies, who all come from all disparate parts of the globe, that you're going to like throw 100 of them together in a community and it's going to be like a community. It's like, that's not a community. That's like a mall. That doesn't, in my experience, this rarely works. And what I notice is people tend to want to do it on ideology. So it'll be like, well, we're a bunch of people who do paleo diets. We're going to live together. Or like our thing is, Mormonism or whatever your thing is. Like people want to get together based on, it's the old tribal thinking. We want to get together based on how everyone else is different from us. And we're the right ones. We're the, like all of these tribal names, when you look back at like, what do different tribal names mean? The most common thing it means is the real ones or the real people.
Yeah.
Like everybody else is like fake people. So you see that mindset still going on. So I'm a little concerned that we're learning that community is really important to our health and longevity, but that we have lost the mechanisms to actually create meaningful communities because nobody's related. The families are too small. No one really knows each other, has history with each other, shares blood. It's just ideological. And those people they tend to eat each other alive, like quite cannibalistically after a while. We see that playing out in the media all the time.
Yeah.
But I want to add this other component too. What about community is it only species wide or is it interspecies? Because one other concern I have is that we're just talking about people, but people are very isolated now from the community of species that we share. I'm not talking about like on a grand scheme, like, oh, all the creatures of the world unite, like Noah's Ark. I mean, like, how many animals can you name in your backyard? Like, how many animals from your environment? If you don't hunt or fish or bird or do something like that, probably not very many. Like, we are just so ignorant of the plant, fungi, animal, and algal species around us.
Yep.
We just think people. That's why we start thinking like, oh, we keep on going like this forever. It's like, yeah, if we eradicate. So I think human beings are incredibly lonely at the species level right now. And I think this is affecting us in a really big way. And we feel isolated because all we have are other people. And we're supposed to know, like your average hunter-gatherer would know hundreds of plant species and dozens of animal species, not just know their name, like know their whole life cycle and when they breed and where to find them and how to use them, how to detoxify them, how to break them down, how they interrelate with one another, what they eat, like all of this kind of stuff. And we are so ignorant right now that it's like we've been living in a little closet with each other. And I think we need to break out of that pattern before we start trying to like start utopian communities together. I think we should probably get to know the community of life around us. It's really sad. Have you seen that study where it was like children in New York City being asked to name animals, and
No.
All they were really be able to name was like animal, like little kids. I don't remember the age group, but young. All they were able to name was like animals from Africa. So like little kids are like lion, zebra, elephant. And it's like, okay, you live in New York. Like, what about the animals there? And then when they did quiz them on the animals there, they had negative feelings about those animals. Raccoons, they're dirty, they're dangerous, they have rabies. Skunks, they stink. Oh, they're gross. You know what I'm saying? So we have this weird thing where we have fantasies about animals in other places, but here we don't even know the animals that live where we live. It's astonishing the degree of ignorance. I mean, I was in Arizona recently. I got to eat an animal I didn't even know existed. The coatimundi. I didn't even know that was an animal. It's like, wow, there's that a mammal this big walking around in Arizona. You didn't even know it was an animal. Lived in the United States my whole life. Been to Arizona 50 times. How did I not know that?
Is it
That's
like
frightening.
It's like a rabbit or something? What is it? What is that?
It's like a ringtail or a raccoon in that family. Yeah, it's related to the ringtails raccoons.
Do you have a hard out that you need to leave? I want to be aware. Okay, no, good, great. No, not that I'll keep on going, but I think there's still more here.
There's more juice in this.
Yeah. So there's two things. One, just an unnecessary term that came up that I actually wanted to mention this conversation that you're describing now that I learned recently was from Sigmund Freud, and is called the narcissism of small differences. And that's the tendency that we have of nitpicking these little separations or differences between each other, because ultimately we feel, I mean, I might be projecting this, but I think we feel insecure with who we are, and it's like, am I enough? Well, if you're bad, or I'm smart and you're dumb or whatever, then just by default, that means that I'm okay and my tribe is right and their tribe is wrong. And it's kind of coming, and we end up spending like spinning our wheels in these differences. And then, I think we can end up destroying ourselves in the process of finding how we're different, as opposed to going from this other place of like working together. And then, so that was just a separate tangent that I thought was interesting. And I wanted to say as you're going, but the second thing that you were talking about in relation to animals and not understanding the world around us, I feel like it's interesting, because it's like, there's another book called Whatever You Think the Opposite, very short book by Paul Arden, and essentially it's so paradoxical that the more we focus on ourselves, I think the deeper we dig ourselves into depression and anxiety and disassociation in a way. Like if you're too excessively focused in on self and in on human, and you miss out on what's happening in your extrinsic reality, it becomes incredibly lonely.
Yeah.
And even if you look at art, like I think like ancient Chinese art is an example of that, like Taoist art or Confucian art, I believe. I'm not an expert in art either. I borrowed this from Ellen Watts. But the older art, you'd see the focal point of the art was nature. So there'd be a person doing its thing, taking a walk or whatever, but it's just kind of like a part of the nature. And now draw that to now, and it's like selfie. Like this is like
Cardi B. It's like, wow,
screw the room, screw the tree. Like, this is it. My nose. Yeah. I got a nose job. Look at it. And then within that, behind that, it's like, then we see, I'm not saying this is causative, but it's certainly corollary to the statistical trend towards, what we're seeing in industrialized populations of all things: fat, anxious, depressed. And that's not the entire, I think we can also paint a really like almost like malicious view on what's happening in the world. There's also a lot of beauty in the world. And I think that sometimes we can be a part of the problem by projecting more of this like vitriol onto what's happening. And there's also the availability and option and opportunity to see the beauty and kind of like stoke that ember of what's right. Anyways, that was a lot of words. And there was no question.
I grew up in Christendom. Yeah. And, the Catholics are, there's some divisions there for sure, but they're largely the Catholics compared to, I know there's like some Vatican I, Vatican II type things going on, but when you look at the Protestants, it's like a gazillion kinds of Protestant. And I remember this argument of the Navalites where it was cause there was argument, well, would Adam and Eve have had navels because they weren't born and therefore never had an umbilical scar? And this is enough to fracture a church. Like, well, we're the Navalites. We believe that they did have navels and we believe they didn't have navels. I do think it goes back to the need for status. And I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean that in a purely clinical sense. Like that's part of the hierarchy of needs, actually. Is like, you need to know where you fit. Even if you're the runt of the litter or you're the one who's like the scapegoat, that's like a total archetype role. Someone has to play it. We all know people who play it. It's like someone has to play the low status role in the group. In fact, there's arguments to be made that the low status person holds the group together, which is interesting, but it's the same in a pack of dogs or a pack of wolves or whatever it is. There's all this status. It's funny because there's been this war against the hierarchies lately in the world. And in some cases, as it should be, but it's gone a little too far because hierarchies are natural too. They form naturally amongst all kinds of animals. And, so we are always trying to figure out where we are in the hierarchy. And then we do that tribally, and and then we do it nationally, and we do it, probably if we encounter something extraterrestrial, we'll do it with them. Like, well, we're the original biology. You're the fake one. You're the artificial one, like whatever it is, we're going to have that with AIs, like, well, we're the star-bellied Sneeches. So that's I don't know if anybody gets that. That's a,
I get that.
Don't get it. It's sorry. It's what's his name? Cat in the Hat there. Dr. Seuss book. I grew up with, called the Star-bellied Sneeches. It's a good read. It's about this.
Can you say more about the lower end of the hierarchy potentially holding it together? I've never heard that, and that seems very interesting.
Yeah, because like it keeps us from turning on each other. It's a place to vent our aggressions, and it's a place to vent our frustrations, and somebody who scapegoats and takes the abuse keeps us from all turning on each other.
Yep.
It's like, did you ever have that friend, or were you that person or something? You know what I mean? Where I've been that person, and I've been on the other end of it too. But it's like, for instance, when I hang out with a lot of hunters who are like old school hunters, like, newsflash, none of them have long hair or tattoos like I do. Like no one looks like me. So I'm the weird one, and I tend to be one of the younger ones. They love to just pick on me, and it becomes like this thing where it's like, okay, I have to just take it. It's like, okay, whatever. I'm learning from these people, and it's fun. Whatever, I'll just take it. Right. But it's a way for the group to vent off frustrations too, So there's something to that, like the runt of the litter in a pack of wolves or coyotes or something can play that role that takes the tension off for everybody else,
and allows males or females that feel inclined towards an alpha position to be able to hold that. There's a certain like dynamic tension there. It's like, oh, if I get knocked out of that position. So by having a clear runt or lower on the ladder individual, it's like, okay, there's this polarity there. There's actually
somebody can go kick.
There's a quote I wrote down from Freud in relation to that thing that you might appreciate. It says, it is always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love, so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness.
Yeah. So to me, like, I get confused sometimes, like why we want to, like, I think Elon Musk said, summon the demon of AI. Like, why we want to do that before we work out our like most basic issues. It's so crazy to me, because it's like, let's say somebody comes to you and they want to train, physically, and they want to, and you're like, dude, you need to build a basic cardio foundation. You need a basic, we need to develop like your basic skeletal muscle before you can start doing parkour, let's say, or something like that. It's like, hey, you're not ready for that. And it's like, you got to start at the beginning of any endeavor that you do, like I know in all my hobbies, what I notice, I take on a lot of new hobbies, and I get to perpetually be the new guy at something. And you come in and you want to do all the sexy shit at the top. And the people at the top always tell you the same thing, dude, it's just doing the fundamentals well. But it's like, oh, the fundamentals are boring. No, people don't often want to do the real work. Have you noticed that the top, like, to be in the top of something, you don't have to be that good. You just have to put in a little more work than everybody. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, have you noticed that? Like you want to be in the top 90th percentile, it probably takes 5% more work than everybody. Not much more, just a little bit more. Yeah. But people, like, they come in and they want it to be, they want to do all the sexy stuff first. And it's like, no, you got to do the basics. Get that stuff worked out. Then you can start to build upon those fundamentals. We're not even like working through our basic shit as a culture, and we want to be gods. And I don't like say that lightly. Like, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build a new universe and populate it. And we're trying to create artificial life forms and give them sentience. So we are trying to be gods, and we haven't even figured out at like basic social dynamics. It's like, to me, we need to get back to our fundamentals. I guess I worry that have you ever seen a kid with a rich parents, like really, really rich parents? Maybe they have a trust fund of some kind, or they're just set up in life, and you just watch them just piss it away or destroy their lives, where you're like, man, if you could just, I feel like that's how we are, where it's like, here we are, we made it to the top of this hierarchy of needs the first time. What are we going to do with it? And look at what we're doing. We're creating this idiocracy, and it's sad because it's such an awesome opportunity. Some of us are trying in our flawed ways. I mean, I think most people who listen to shows like this, like they're working on themselves. That's why they're listening, right? We're all work in progress, but we're really flawed. So it's slow, and we piece by piece, and we make gains, and we fall off, and whatever it is, but we're trying, but culturally we're not, honestly. I mean, you look at, like, there's been this big push, like I said, to change a bunch of our big social dynamics, but it's been more of a blame game than it has been an edification of anything, right? You just look, it's just like tearing people down. It's like, what an opportunity, man. Like, let's seize this. Like, wow, we get this chance, might be the only chance. I don't think the solution is AI or becoming gods. I think the solution is taking advantage of this moment and doing some personal work individually, culturally, and as a species.
Earlier, you just kind of like flippantly tossed out that we've been creating gods perpetually throughout history, and then as just like a throwaway point, and then you kept going with what you were talking about.
Well, what's like one of the oldest stories is the Tower of Babel.
Right. Or maybe not flippantly,
right? So,
but you said it as a throwaway.
Well, I mean,
it wasn't so
I know what you're saying.
It was a throwaway, like, oh, it's like, I'm like, what?
Well, if we can do like the Jordan Peterson approach and just be like, hey, however you feel about the Bible, have some freaking respect, man. This is like the oldest thing like there's cuneiform tablets in Mesopotamia that are 6,000 years old, but none of us have copies of them. You don't go down to the bookstore and find those, right? Like the Bible, this like library of books, is some of the oldest transmission. I mean, writing is not very old. Like, people should really understand that. I always joke around about people 6,000 years ago, old curmudgeons who are like, you kids today with your writing, my day, we remembered all our stories.
It's true. There was resistance.
That's just 6,000 years ago.
There was distrust. There was distrust and resistance around writing because the belief that you're gonna spoil your memory.
Right.
It's literally the same as now with outsourcing, technology and your movement to whatever, pressing a button for your garage door to go up instead of you doing it yourself.
It's also not true though.
Yeah.
Because I don't remember much of anything anymore like I used to. Do you find yourself, like, be really honest here, do you find yourself doing really, really simple math problems on your phone because that part of your brain is
so embarrassing? And like, then I stop myself. And then I still will
5 minus 9. I'll just use my phone. Like, what? What? Yeah. So it's like, both things are true. We've always been like this, and each time it has been an incremental loss of capability and then a gaining of capability, because it's like that Einstein thing. Why would you store something in your mind you could put on paper? I get that. But then we end up at the point where we go out in our backyard and we don't know what anything is.
Yeah.
Right? Like, the average person can tell you they have a lawn, but they couldn't tell you what species of grass is on it. Isn't that odd? Like, that's really odd. Like, imagine you planted your whole lawn and you don't even know what species of grass you planted. Like, that's fucking weird, man. Right? Somebody's like, oh, what kind of dog is that? Don't know.
Yeah.
Don't know. What's your kid's name? Don't know. Why would I memorize it? I could write it down. So, but anyway, the point is, the Bible is a really, really old knowledge that's been transmitted. So it's got a tremendous amount of cultural value, particularly when you go like, hey, this thing has a lot of meaning to all the Christians and all the Muslims and all the Jews. There's a lot of people. So it's pretty important stuff. And there's a story in there, the Tower of Babel, and it's about people who are wanting to be gods. And so they're building this tower to try to reach heaven. They want to be God. They want to usurp God. In other words, rather than enjoying the creation and the purpose of being in the creation, they want to be the creators of creation. And that ends very badly for them. And why were people talking about this? However long ago that was, 4,000 years ago. Why was that even, like, what is that? Right. And so it's deep in us, this idea of, we're not content to enjoy the creation. We want to create it ourselves. Or create another thing to call that is Luciferianism. And I think maybe we could ask ourselves, are we becoming Luciferian in nature, in our culture? And I think a lot of people would not only say yes, but would think that was a good thing. So that's why I don't mean to be the old curmudgeon here today. Like, oh, everything's bad. It's all so bad what we're doing. It's terrible. It's terrible. But it's like, I lived in a house once when I was a kid, and the family that had moved out of that house, their daughter had been murdered in a satanic ritual. And that's just like a weird anecdote, but it's like, hey, that's not good. Right? That's like, you can't spin that good for me. Even when we do like what you were saying before as a mental exercise, like we could do the zoom out and be like, okay, how does this fit into the big picture of all the evolution of the universe? It's like, I just don't think that's good. And so, hey, like Luciferianism, it's like, I don't think it's good. I don't care if Jay-Z's into it or whatever. I don't think it's good.
How do you define, I've read the Satanic Bible is the extent of my foray into knowing, understanding anything about Satanism. And I actually found it really interesting. And I actually saw a lot of points that I aligned with throughout it. Sure. To be perfectly honest, a big part was like the releasing of shame. Of like, if you have a sensation or a feeling, you want to have sex with a person, you want to kill a person, you want to like whatever you're having, it's not slapping a moralistic. Okay, you're a naughty boy. You're a good girl. It's saying It's like yes,
that's a component of it.
Yeah, here that is.
Hey, there was like really good stuff the Nazis did too. You know what I mean? They furthered science, like how much science, right? They did some good stuff.
Or Scientology.
And by the way, they did like the worst shit in modern history too. Yeah. So just because there's goodness in something doesn't mean the totality of the thing is good. Right.
And then is casting it out entirely appropriate, or does that potentially perpetuate the problem of separation? And maybe there are need to be cast out. And sometimes there's a cancer that needs to be cut out, and that's the appropriate procedure, is we need to actually excise it from the body. And then sometimes there's the opportunity to like love the cancer, and go to Peru and drink ayahuasca and realize you had some issues with your mom or your dad, and you had this like adrenal fatigue because you always feel like you're under stress and panic, and you don't sleep and you don't wake properly, and you're addicted to drugs, and you get down to the root, and suddenly that manifestation of cancer doesn't need to be there anymore. And perhaps the cancer actually was there to protect you in some capacity.
Are you playing the devil's advocate right now?
I would never. That's good. Yeah, the Luciferian advocate. That's good.
Well, I think the difference is like kind of one of the oldest human laws is, if it harm none, do as thou wilt. But Satanism is do as thou wilt. And that would be the big difference, right? So that for me is kind of how I would define that. But like one of the things that I love about like the knees over toes guy thing, the phenomena that is sweeping the fitness world. I'm doing all my knees over toes exercises now. Nice. I love the idea of like the reverse squat. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I was just with Ben. We just did a podcast.
Okay, cool.
We were just together awesome. Like a month ago. Yeah.
You mentioned something earlier that reminded me of that too. I can't remember what you were saying, but it's like what he talks about with the reverse squat. It's like, hey, you spend all this time pushing off your legs. Like when you do the opposite motion.
Yeah.
You named a book title, like Everything You Think the Opposite.
Right.
It's the same concept. I don't know what the book's about, but similarly, it's like, that's a good, healthy thing. It's like, hey, if I'm always thinking this, if I'm always like bench pressing, maybe I should do some rows because I want to stay balanced. Like if I'm always thinking this, maybe I should spend a little time thinking the other way, because who's more obnoxious than like political pundits who only just repeat their party's thing all the time? It's like, can you never imagine what other people are thinking? Can you only imagine that? So, I think as an intellectual exercise, what you're saying is super valuable. But again, like a girl dying in a satanic ritual is just not cool to me. What the Nazis did is just not cool to me. And I don't see that as like, I don't think this trajectory of wanting to be gods has ever been good for people. It seems to me whenever we do it, it ends in horrible atrocity, and we all say we'll never let that happen again. And then about 4 generations later, we do it again.
Yeah. Where I got lost in the Satanic Bible was like the rituals and the sacrifice and such. That was the part where I was like, from my stance, I'm not able to grasp this.
Oh, you'll end up sacrificing, your Bitcoin on the altar to the AI eventually, I think. We all will.
Well, we do need to wrap this up at some point. I really greatly appreciate the manner in which you've lived your life to be able to have conversations like this.
Likewise, man. Likewise.
Yeah, I highly recommend people checking out. I'm not even that into hunting and gathering and things of the sort. I mean, I do bow hunt. I've bow hunted once. I have a bow. I more just bow shoot than bow hunt. I'd like to bow hunt.
What kind of bow do you have?
A Hoyt RX5, a carbon guy. I'm so happy about it. It's so rad. It makes me happy. It's such a beautiful piece of art and technology fused together into one, like, it's rad experience.
It's weird how the bow has been a weapon for about like 65,000 years or so, and it's still being used to hunt. Like, it's still relevant even in the era of the nuclear, of like the thermonuclear bomb.
Yeah.
It's still a relevant weapon. It's pretty unusual.
And still awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
Like, not just still relevant, it's still like you get a bunch of dudes or gals around, the new carbon fiber, super duper, all the things.
Yeah.
And everybody just goes, whoa.
Yeah, I know. I asked, like, I was talking to Katie Bowman once, and I was like, hey, if you lived in a part of the world, like, let's say genetically you come from a place where the bow has been around for, tens of thousands of years, is the asymmetry of pulling that bow genetically in us? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like, some places, like, maybe it only came to the Americas 4,000 years ago. So it's relatively new technology here. But in some places, it's really old. Like, we've done that a long time. Every time you pull that bow, is there like resonance in your genome somewhere to something that how many men in your lineage did that? Like, we're talking like tens of thousands of years. So if a generation's 50 years, it's amazing to me to think about. Super cool. We can still do it today.
Yeah, I mean, you see all that with the studies with rats and such, and the one of the ones was exposing rats. Their I believe it was, I'm fuzzy on this, but it was exposing rat mothers to a shock and then exposing them to like a particular odor, like a chemical odor. And they would go through that. And then when the rat pups would come about, when they would smell that odor, they would have all the same signals of cortisol and norepinephrine and all, like the stress signal that, oh my God, I'm about to get a shock. And I wonder if there could be some type of like musculoskeletal relation. And because there is something that, and that might be a big jump, but there is something interesting that happens when you are doing, like, I went to, a lot of this could just be my own kind of story and psychosomatic stuff, but I went to Morocco a while ago. I was there for like a couple months. And while I was there, I felt like this just like deep, like oldness. I don't know exactly what it is. And I think we have so many experiences throughout our lives, or, many people have that experience with like hunting. I had that with hunting as well. But there's so many things where it's like, it touches on something that you didn't know that you had. And it's hard to talk about it because it's hard to quantify it. It's hard to kind of like put it like, haha, this is it, but there's something really magical about that sensation. And it seems like perhaps there could be some type of tapping into some ancestral, I don't know, connection or messaging or something, but it's hard to say without kind of even like eye rolling it yourself. You know what I mean?
I don't eye roll myself at that.
Oh, good.
I'm feeling it, dude. I guess like kind of in conclusion, everything today, it's like, okay, so I'm see if I can kind of bring all this around, because we use this term right now in our culture. We'll say that person's a conservative, that person's a liberal. And they're like, they hate each other or whatever. When, I always go like, hey, dude, every plane I fly on has like a left and a right wing. I kind of want both wings on the plane. Like, I don't want to be in a left wing only plane or a right wing only plane. They crash. I kind of want both wings equally working to balance it. That was the idea, right? And I think people are naturally born, leaning one way or the other. They kind of lean more conservative or liberal, right? So today we use the term progressive. So today I've been saying like, hey, progressivism trends towards transhumanism, but obviously conservatism can trend towards stagnation, right? So you kind of want both horses pulling kind of opposite directions so you can go forward, right? So when we're talking about this stuff, you're talking about that's conservatism. Like when you're like ancestral diets, talk about being conservative. You're going all the way back. You're like, I think it should be like it was 3 million years ago. Like, that's very conservative, right? And we need that, but we also need progress. Like, it's like, hey, how do we get out of this tribal thinking? Well, it's like we need to progress, but we can't do that without the antagonism of conservatism, and we don't want conservatism without the antagonism. So it's like, whatever you think the opposite. Or hey, if you're going to bench press, row, or if you're going to squat, do a reverse squat, because you want to be balanced. Yep. And I think with these kind of conversations, it's important to realize like there's not a right one. It's not like the right thing is AIs, or the right thing is going all the way back to the original, hunting with a bow, like on the Sahara. It's like the zoo to me is the middle approach, the middle road. And, that's like that Buddhist thing.
Yeah, I feel like that's exactly. Before this, there was something that I was like, an idea that came up for me that I actually wanted to talk about that I wrote down, was reaching a point of interdependence in a relationship is like a healthy thing to have established. So it's not that I'm so independent and sovereign that I just don't need anything and I'm just alone in my meat suit and just like I provide everything for the meat suit. Like that's a very lonely, desolate existence. And then there's excessive dependence where it's like, well, without you, like you're my oxygen. Without you, I'm nothing. It's like, well, that's really unhealthy too. And then you can reach a point of this like new stage of interdependence. And I think that's exactly what you get at with your work, is not completely divorcing ourselves from modernity, and villainizing. It's like, oh my God, it's just all bad. It's like, no, there's actually a lot of value to be pulled from that. And in reference to like the hawks living 5 years or 20 years, whether they're in captivity or in the wild. So it's like, okay, we can pull from that. And I think there's a deep subconscious like angst in knowing that your livelihood and everything, your happiness, your access to food, your access to everything is based off of this system that was created X amount of, hundreds or thousands of years ago. And it's run by these like potentially maniacal figures, they're going to war and pressing buttons and like, gas prices are up or food. It's like, I just hope I'm okay. I hope they don't do anything that causes me to starve. Like that's a really scary, deep sensation of angst that any person, whether they realize it or not, at a deeper subconscious level, probably I would think if they're, they would experience. And so to come to a place of like interdependence where we can work together, I can engage with that system and pull all the goodness and contribute all the goodness. And I do understand how to do my own level of hunting and gathering and homesteading. And so those are things that I'm engaged with. I feel like there's a deep sensation of liberation that very few people probably will ever actually experience, but the few that do would be like, oh yeah, that's good.
You got to Trojan horse that message though, man, because like you're on YouTube, like what's the least clickable headline? It's like balance is the way. It's like,
exactly.
Like people want to hear like extreme, right? Like, down with the other side. So, but yeah, I think the reality, we all know that. I think we all know this, like, hey, a balanced approach is the way to do it, but it's just doesn't sell, man.
It's not like, interesting.
Yeah. No, well, I think it is once you hook somebody on it, but like, it doesn't get you to, it doesn't scare you. It's like, hey, big storm coming with potential landslides sells a lot more newspapers than sunny day tomorrow.
Yeah.
So, people don't want to hear like they just whatever.
I see the headline of this podcast: Aaron Alexander becomes a Satanist. We're like,
okay, yeah, cool. Exactly.
The whole entire thing. Oh, he's a Satanist. Perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Aligned with the Satanic Bible.
So where can people go to get deeper into your work? You have, where do people go from here?
Sure. So, like, as you mentioned, I have a podcast called WildFed, and I have a pretty big archive of episodes of another show called Rewild Yourself that still gets a lot of play. It's a much broader show talking about more topics related to sort of ancestral living and health. But my current show, WildFed, is much more focused on wild foods and ecology. And then I have a TV show on Outdoor Channel. We're in our second season, which is pretty cool. We're airing. I think we aired our third episode of the season on Monday. So if folks have cable, I know almost nobody does, but if you have cable, I'm on Outdoor Channels Monday nights at 7:30, and then you can see the shows. Season 1 is on myoutdoortv.com. That's their streaming service. And then we always tell people to get this service called Friendly, FRNDLY TV.com. That gives you access to a cable bundle streaming online, so you can see the show Monday nights at 7:30 on Outdoor Channel through Friendly as well. And I'm on Instagram at Daniel Vitalis.
No, and you have supplements and things of the sort.
And I've got a company now. My company Surthrival has been in business now, Aaron, for 15 years, man.
And you've been you've been touting a lot of the things that have become popularized in the last few years, like colostrum and things of the sort, which I think is just so. We actually have a similar story of discovering raw dairy and butter, and I don't know about honey for you, but I went like I like OD'd on honey as well. But I went through the very similar thing of like, eating a half gallon of cream and a pound of butter and such in a day.
Did you? Yeah.
So we both have oscillated through that. But
I just put out three new colostrum products. So we did like these a a chocolate, a vanilla, and a strawberry using like the real thing, not like, artificial flavor. And man, I've been eating it out of the tub by the spoon, and it's not good to do what I'm doing. I'm eating like, several cups of it at a time and then drinking a lot of water and going to sleep. But anyway, those products are awesome. Like colostrums, I'm such a huge fan of it. And I got some really cool products on the way as well. So yeah, surthrival.com, like survive and thrive, surthrival. Yeah, I know we're trying to wrap it up here, but last point.
Oh, it's fine. It's fine. I'm in no rush.
Coming out of a Whole Foods the other day with my producer Grant, and we were on a shoot in Florida, I think. And so we're coming out of this Whole Foods, and I am having this experience now where I just cannot stand to be in a Whole Foods. Are you in Austin?
Yeah, Mecca.
Okay.
Whole
so
Foods
think
capital.
about all the things that you can't stand about Whole Foods, right? So we're coming out of Whole Foods, and all those things I'm like feeling all like, oh God, this is like insane. And we come outside and I go like, this is what we spent all those decades trying to create. And now it's here, like when there was no health food stores, when there was no organic certification. Like I remember the days before any of this stuff. And I worked so hard, and so many people worked so hard to bring this stuff into culture. And now that it's here and it's like in this like Walmart model, I'm like, I don't like it anymore.
Yep.
But it's cool to see, like, even though I can get a little frustrated by like how it manifests today, we brought about the things in culture that we were working to bring about. That's really cool. So I know when you're 10 years ahead or 15 years ahead or even 5 years ahead of where things are at, like you were talking about finding like butter, before they were like big movements around these things. When you're ahead of things, it can feel like, man, no one gets it. It's really lonely. And then over time, like it works its way in, and you like anchor those things into culture. So, for all the stuff that we're out ahead of right now, it's cool to know that in 5 or 10 years, they'll be mainstream. That's kind of exciting,
Yeah. Do you feel like, I wonder with you, do you feel like you have maybe like an inherent nature to kind of do the opposite? Do you think if everyone became super healthy, whatever thing, you'd like suddenly go full Oculus?
Yeah, no, not Oculus, but yeah, I think because when things get entrenched, they become religious and dogmatic, and then I think they get unhealthy. It's like that movie Chocolat. I love that movie. It's like what happens when we get too rigid on an idea and an ideology. This is an ism thing. It's like the ideology. It's like as soon as you start being like, I'm a whateverist, it's like, oh, you're in a bad territory. Time to shed that label and move on. So yeah, I do that, but because you need to do a reverse squat if you do squats.
Yeah.
That's why I do that.
And I think it's such a valuable thing to have just the self-observation to be able to see your own trends. And that's like your own trends are sometimes the hardest to spot. Yeah. I think a lot of people's personality types and perspectives and ideologies and such were fleshed out during the time frame of the lockdowns, and BLM and all that. Like there's people that like they were like your good times bros, we're like, oh yeah, cool, like yeah, we just hang out, we Netflix, chill, swing kettlebells, go for hikes, like it's all good. Suddenly the shit hits the fan, and you see these deeper sub personalities start to express out, and as we kind of got exposed to this I think it is like one of those like Chinese sushi conveyor belts of like issues that everyone needs to be focused on and like virtue signal on the internet about to make sure that you're a part of the right tribe. I could almost see my own trends of like, oh, if that comes up, I almost know my reaction to the thing before the thing happens. And it's like, wow, like what is that reaction? Is that, do I actually believe what I believe?
Or am I just resisting it because
running out?
COVID first started, like when I first heard that COVID was happening, bro, before it was even a thing over here, I'm at my post office in rubber gloves and a mask.
Yeah.
As soon as they started telling me I had to do that, I was like, I don't know. Is there any science to this? You know what I mean? It's just contrarianism. So
it's important.
Whatever. But you got to live a while before you can start to even see these patterns in yourself. You got to get around the sun a few times anyway. Yeah. If you're in your 20s, it's kind of hard to know.
Damn millennials. All right. Well, thank you so much for this. I really enjoyed this. I look forward to the next time. Hopefully we'll do it in person. And so check out Surthrival.
There you go. Surthrival. SURTHRIVAL.
Cool.
Surthrival.
And then WildFed is the show. And it's the podcast.
Yep, you got it.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate you. This is fantastic. And
thanks for having me on, man.
Thank you all for tuning in. That's it. That's all. Over and out. Wow.